Can you tell us what your name is, where you grew up, and when you were a student at Vanderbilt?
Kim Leslie Shafer, and I'm Kim, but I love my middle name, so I use Kim Leslie Shafer. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, and I arrived at Vanderbilt in 1975 and graduated in 1979.
Okay, great, thank you. So, what led you to attend school at Vanderbilt?
I was offered a Harold Sterling Vanderbilt scholarship. It was actually the first year that those were offered, which were full merit-based scholarships, and my middle-class parents thought it was an enormous amount of money, and Vanderbilt was a good school, so I should come, and so I did.
So, what did you know about Vanderbilt before coming in? Did you visit?
I did visit. I had not visited before applying, but my mother and I flew down, and I frankly had my heart set on going to one or two Ivy League schools where I was indeed accepted, but there was nothing that we could object to at Vanderbilt, so. So I came and learned that the political science department was quite strong, and that was my interest. So that was about it.
Okay. So how did the environment on Vanderbilt's campus compare to the environment of your high school?
So I went to a public high school. It was fairly large. It was the suburbs, so there were very few, we used the term African Americans then, a lot of ethnics, a lot of Jews. I was Jewish. And so I arrived at Vanderbilt that was where at least the dominant culture, if not the demographics, were Southern or Texan prep schools. From quite affluent families, white, blonde, Christian, and it was a different culture. It was a different culture to me, coming from suburban Philadelphia, sort of middle class.
Can you think of any examples of things that kind of shocked you or kind of called you up short a little bit?
I tried to unearth things from my memory in advance of coming for this, and the one thing I do remember, I went through Rush. I wasn't completely convinced I wanted to join a sorority. I ultimately did not, but I remember being asked in the first sort of sit-down one-on-one, so what does your father do? And I was completely taken aback. Like, what does that have to do with who I am and what kind of student I am and what my personality is or what I want to do in life? So that jarred me and therefore stuck with me.
Yeah, so kind of a focus on social status was sort of something that was being marked in that kind of investigative question.
I think particularly in the Greek, in among certain of the Greek sororities and fraternities, yes.
Interesting. Was there, I have a question here, did most of the women who attended Vanderbilt with you graduate? Was it common for women to drop out of school if they got engaged or married?
By those years, no.
Yeah.
I remember perhaps a few engagements senior year, but no one dropped out at that point. I do remember some women being anxious about not having found a husband that they were supposed to. That was a distinct minority, so, but that was a little bit present. And then on the other hand, I know some classmates who not immediately, but later married other classmates.
Oh.
So they did find a partner here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Were there any characteristics or stereotypes of like a typical Vanderbilt? They used to call them a typical Vanderbilt co-ed.
Indeed. Yes. Always dressed nicely, always very polite, typically blonde, typically in a sorority, typically got up early in the morning so she could look her best for class, whereas others of us didn't do that. Cared about having a date on Saturday night, were ashamed if they didn't have a date on Saturday night and hid. That was really the dominant culture. There were plenty of students, including me, who did not fit that dominant culture, but that was the TVC culture.
So the TVC culture was still pretty...
Very strong.
Very strong. Interesting. Okay. You already kind of alluded to this by talking about where people came from and that they kind of had maybe a prep school background. Was there any kind of racial and socioeconomic diversity on campus that you saw?
There were 3% Jews when I was there. There were, I don't know how small the number was of blacks or of other ethnics for that matter. And the blacks were, I think, pretty segregated, unfortunately. I've lost track of the question, I'm sorry.
No, and also socioeconomic background.
One thing I remember very much for the men, many of them arrived with polyester shirts and the like, and they went home for Thanksgiving and came back with khakis and polo shirts, preferably Izod shirts and button-down shirts. And there was a wardrobe for men that was a very preppy wardrobe. There was a little more diversity, as there always is among women's clothing, but like they switched.
Right, so they got the memo.
They got the memo, and however they could manage it, they acquired the conforming attire.
So, was there a community of Jews on campus since it was such a small minority?
CBT fraternity was a bit of that. There was a Hillel, but it wasn't active virtually at all. I went to maybe 2 events my whole time there. There was no Jewish sorority. There had been in decades past. Mm-hmm. We learned that Dinah Shore, the late Dinah Shore, who was Jewish, had been on a Jewish sorority on campus in prior decades. There was another fraternity that was largely Jewish, but neither of the 2 fraternities were exclusively Jewish. And so at least some of us all knew each other freshman year as little sisters at the ZBT fraternity. Folks who have known me since are always shocked to learn that I was a little sister at a fraternity, but it was actually a helpful social transition particularly for freshman year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So where did you live?
Sorry, and I should add, just because this has come up, that another anecdote, just because they're so revealing, that beyond my freshman year, on spring break, a bunch of students went on cruises or on other lovely vacations. I did not. And there were a group of ZBT boys who ended up on a cruise with girls from a certain sorority. I'm not going to mention it.
Mm-hmm.
And they all got along great on the cruise. That sorority at that time had no Jewish members. And there was talk about having a party together once they got back to campus, but that fell apart.
Oh.
So it wasn't spoken about, but there were social differences. There were social differences.
And kind of
Unspoken.
lines that you didn't cross. In
Correct.
A sense.
Or that you were wary of and avoided.
Interesting. So where did you live when you attended Vanderbilt?
So I looked this back up.
Uh-huh.
So I remembered Branscombe and Lupton Hall,
Okay.
and then I had to recall the names of places. So I was then in McTier,
Mm-hmm.
and then in McGill,
Okay.
and I chose McGill especially because they had a once-a-week hour with faculty that you were supposed to have conversations about philosophy or the like. And then when I became student government president, the perk of that was I got to live in West Side Row. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Did you have any concerns about safety on campus?
No,
Okay.
no, I didn't, thankfully.
So tell us a little bit about what you studied at Vanderbilt and what your career aspirations were.
I majored in political science, although I took more economics courses than poli-sci courses. I foolishly didn't finish that major. I should have, but I suddenly, as a senior, wanted to take some anthropology courses and veered off that way. I also took a lot of literature courses, both in the English department and one or two outside. And then your basic distribution requirements, I think. I was, at that time, both in high school, college, and for a number of years after college, passionately interested in politics and democratic politics. And even at that time aspired to running for public office myself, which is something I certainly gave up and did not want to pursue as an adult. But I will say being student government president was a little bit of a test run for me of did I like being a public person. And at that time, I really loved it. And so we can get into that, but I had a fellowship before law school after Vanderbilt, and then went to work for a law firm, practiced law, worked on the national staff of two losing Democratic presidential campaigns, and then went to work in Washington for the Senate Banking Committee, and then after that took other career turns. But I did pursue politics in my earlier years.
So when you were you Phi Beta Kappa? I thought I read
Yes, junior year.
that. Yeah, which is an incredible accomplishment. I'm Phi Beta Kappa. But I only got in my senior year. So were you encouraged by faculty members to pursue professional school / graduate school?
I would say, first of all, and maybe this is gendered, but that I was pretty headstrong. And so I don't know if faculty advisors felt, oh, well, Kim knows what she wants to do, so I'm not going to push her in one way or another. Or that they might have really sat me down in a different way had I been either less headstrong or male. I do remember this story that freshman year I took Econ 101 and just easily aced it. I got hundreds on virtually all the exams, while I had friends and classmates who were really struggling. It just seemed very logical and easy to me. And one day in Rendig Fells I was eating lunch, and I don't recall actually whether he sat down with me or I was bold enough to sit down with him. And I asked him a question about, well, if economics is based on so many models, but psychology of people's reactions really matter to what actually happens, why isn't that considered in what you're teaching us? Was it early premonitions of behavioral economics? And he didn't have an answer for me, and I think he actually slightly took offense at the question. He was a wonderful educator, and he was very clear in his teaching, which I clearly benefited from. But I then went on and took more economics classes, and I think someone from the economics department should have, in retrospect, should have reached out to me and talked to me about, you seem to have a gift for some of this, and do you want to think about what this might look like? And I, have passing regrets about that. And I do wonder, was that partly because why was that?
Why was that? Yeah. No, I can understand that. So you're sort of alluding to this already, but can you talk a little bit about your experience as you said, a girl or a woman in your classes at Vanderbilt? Were you treated differently from male students, and did you feel comfortable speaking up?
I certainly was the vocal and opinionated type, so I felt comfortable. I don't really think that we were treated differently in class. I don't recall, although I have certainly experienced this in professional life since, that men speak up and that women don't, or that women will voice something and men will voice the same thing, and everyone will not acknowledge what the woman says and nod their heads. And I don't recall any of that. It may be that I wasn't sensitive to it at the time, but I don't recall that. And I think perhaps let's give credit to not all professors, but most professors who cared about eager students, and they didn't really care of what variety they came in.
Yeah, for sure. Were there any tensions between men and women on campus? So more thinking about the student life, either in the classroom or outside of the classroom.
I don't know if you could say there were tensions. There were certainly different roles and different expectations, and as a female, you were supposed to act a certain way, and guys were expected to act another way. And many of the co-eds did not have ambitious career, did not have career ambitions, or they were muted.
So were you encouraged to get involved on campus? And did you feel kind of welcome?
Did I finish it? I feel like I didn't finish the tension question.
Oh, yes. You go back to the tension question. Thank you.
So my memory is more that there were two different cultures, or at least two different cultures. There was the standard majority TVC fraternity culture, and then there were the independents who operated differently. And I think, if anything, perhaps there was some tension between those two groups, but that wasn't based as much on gender. Um, I didn't really deal so much directly or pay much attention to whatever part of the male population had very traditional views about what women should be doing or not doing. So I wouldn't say there was real tension, but there were traditional cultures. There was a traditional culture that was the dominant culture at Vanderbilt at that time.
Thanks. So, were you encouraged to get involved on campus? Did you ever feel excluded from any clubs or organizations?
I didn't feel excluded. I was, I think, encouraged by other co-eds who were active in various groups on campus, and they enjoyed it, so I figured I would too, and did things once. I didn't, in freshman year, aspire to be student government president. It was just I aspired to get involved, and I hoped to be part of there being more student-faculty intellectual interaction. So I think I got involved with the Political Science Majors Association, and that led to other things, which then led to student government.
Yeah, talk a little bit about your leadership positions and running for student government.
So the majors associations were part of the academic affairs jurisdiction, if you will, of the student government. And so in my junior year, I was academic affairs chair and tried to encourage all that and tried to encourage, I don't know if this was as a junior or senior, something called Pitchers and Profs, where you could get a mug, get a pitcher at Surratt Pub if you brought a faculty member with you. But the story I'd like to tell about running for student government president, I now have a second story. One is that I had been involved in some of the women's honors associations, and as a result of that, knew at least two girls in each sorority. And so I think my getting elected was an early manifestation of the women's vote on campus, because they got up in their sorority meetings and said, I know Kim and she's a good person, and go vote for her. So I have no statistical evidence that that was true, but it's my very strong hypothesis, and I feel good about that. And so there were 5 or 6 of us who were running for president. I was the lone female. There was a runoff, and the runner, the guy I was pitted against at the end, is a guy named Bruce Heyman. And Vicki Simon, who is now his wife, recently told me that she had campaigned for me. But Vicki then went on in recent years to be a finance chair for the Obama campaign. And her husband ended up as ambassador to Canada, having become a partner at Goldman Sachs. So Bruce turned out fine, and Vicki said to me that I got her start in political campaigns. So I want to give tribute to Vicki.
Well, that's a great story.
Who then was cultural, not ambassador, but she did very significant things when she was in Canada with Bruce.
So this is just a follow-up to that. I've noticed that the student government now, which is called VSG, Vanderbilt Student Government, they tend to run together, the president and the vice president. Was it that way when you ran?
No.
Did you have a partner that you were running with, or was it just you?
No. I was running. I then got to appoint my vice president and appoint cabinet officers. And then there were 2 representatives from each grade. And I was trying to remember and couldn't whether there were any females who were among the grade reps when I was president. And I just don't remember. But this is a bit two-edged. The guy I chose to be my vice president he was a friend of mine who I had gotten to know because of some of these other friends who were in sororities who I had gotten to know because of some of the honor societies. But he was in one of the most social fraternities and was tall and blonde and from Texas. So I very much, although I didn't have to get elected, I balanced the ticket. And he was an excellent partner, and he became student government president after me.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So looking back on it, you could say that knowing that I was not your typical Vanderbilt co-ed person, that I chose him because I wanted broader acceptance. But he was also a really good guy and thoughtful.
Right. And I just say that because I've noticed we don't have a woman who's president of VSG this year, but the last 2 years it's been a woman. But I've noticed that they run typically with somebody of the opposite sex, and I wonder if it's that kind of balance that you're kind of getting at, possibly. So, were you involved in the women's movement when you were on campus?
I don't think there was one, or at least not one that I recollect. I was reminded very recently that Women's Week started while I was on campus. And having been reminded of that, I do think that, oh yeah, that was pretty cool, and there were lots of good talks, whatever. I did meet Sheila Tobias, who wrote a book called Overcoming Math Anxiety, which obviously made an impression since I remember it. And I think I felt validated that there was this attention. And I do think, looking back sort of wistfully, 40 years, that I felt a bit out of place, and that I felt circumscribed, that I self-circumscribed so that I could fit in a little better. So I think these developments were helpful and affirming, but because of who I was, I actually was not out marching.
Yeah.
But I don't think there were any marches during those years.
Right. I think it was probably a fairly conservative campus overall.
Yes.
From what I've read, and from conversations that I've had. But having said that, did you have any interactions with the Women's Center? I guess it opened very near the end of your time at Vanderbilt.
Right. It was very much near the end. And I think Nancy Ransom, the first director, reached out to me, and although I'd never studied with her husband, it probably helped that her husband was a political science professor, so I at least knew his name and knew of him. And we got to know each other a bit, but I don't recall specific programs or anything except the general impression that, gee, this sounds like it's a nice idea.
Right, and those were very early days of the Women's Center. So do you have a favorite or least favorite memory of the time that you spent at Vanderbilt?
I want to speak about Alexander Hurd,
Mm.
who was a wonderful man and was actually very encouraging and helpful to me. He was chancellor then, for those who don't know, and also his wife. So, again, searching for anecdotes and stories, I remember one morning at about 8 a.m., possibly before, there was a phone on the wall in my room, and I got a phone call, and the person said, and this person woke me up. Hello, I'm so-and-so. I want to know if you're here. Could you come to Thanksgiving dinner? This was right before Thanksgiving. And I said, in my haze, no, I think I'm going home. Thank you. And hung up. And then I realized that the person had said, this is Jean Hurd. And I was beside myself. And I called her back. And I did go to Thanksgiving dinner at the Hurds, junior year and senior year. And Mrs. Hurd was wonderful, and I got to know her daughter, Connie, a bit, who was my age as a result. And just seeing how Chancellor Hurd handled his various responsibilities, I think was a wonderful experience.
So how did you get to know him? Was it because you were involved in student government, or had you met him at another point?
It may also have been because I was the
Oh,
HSV
right.
scholar, so there was nothing special except the cost. Like, there were no, I guess they got us together a couple of times, but there wasn't any ongoing anything. But somehow he was aware of me, or maybe I had interacted with him already and just don't recall that. If I may, another favorite memory related to Chancellor Hurd is I had to give a speech to the new freshmen. And I recall talking about how students at Vanderbilt had so many different opportunities of things to participate in. But the student had to be self-motivated to go out and join a club or get involved with a major association or student government or pursue research or whatever it might be, that there were just an enormous array of opportunities. Go take advantage of it. And the Chancellor Hurd liked my speech and praised me afterwards, and that clearly is a memory I carry with me 40 years later.
That's really nice. Is there anything else that you want to add that we haven't talked about?
Oh my. Yes. I've had the chance to hear Nick Zeppos speak twice recently this summer. And I had met him only once when he was provost about 14 years ago. And when I showed up at one speech, he took one look at me and said, "I know you," and said, "I talked to you at Bear Stearns." And I was floored that he would remember that. But I love what Vanderbilt has become. There is so much more diversity here and so much more integration of intellectual and social life that is facilitated by the residential colleges. That transformation, I think, is just wonderful. I also think that the HSV scholarship the fully merit scholarship has gone by the wayside and been replaced by what's called Opportunity Vanderbilt, which helps promote a much larger amount of socioeconomic diversity and brings great students to campus who then attract other great students. So I love how Vanderbilt has come up in the world, how Chancellor Zeppos and others have led the way in doing that. And I hope students are taking advantage of all that's here.
Yeah, I think they are. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My great pleasure.